All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Am I good? Can you hear me? We're all good to go? All right, so we're going to tonight talk a little bit, just sort of high-level intro to attacking ICS and SCADA systems from a pen tester's perspective. A little bit about me, gave a pretty good intro. Yeah, I work at Gotham Digital Science as a cybersecurity engineer. I'm a pen tester, so I like to hack things, get shells on things, pop shells for a living. You know, I've been a SOC analyst before, done some blue team stuff, some server admin, a little bit of development here and there, various things. I like to play in CTF, so I'll probably see you guys in there tomorrow if you're playing. I also am doing a lot of lately ICS SCADA research with my current role that I'm in. We have a lab set up in Texas with various components that you will learn about here today. And I'm also on Twitter, so if you like what you see, follow me. Feel free to ask questions. There'll be time for questions during and after. So what is ICS? Just show of hands. Does anybody know, without looking at the slide, what is ICS? Yes, industrial control systems. So back in the 60s, whenever computers started to get smaller than the size of this room and cost less than millions and millions of dollars, people started to realize that a lot of the heavy lifting equipment that sort of ran the industrial world, it was possible to automate a lot of the things that they did. And so that sort of brought about the advent of industrial control systems, ICS. And every single one of us deals with ICS systems every single day because it runs all the lights, it runs the traffic lights, it runs airports, elevators, anything that moves and is heavy and doesn't have people moving it probably has some manner of ICS system involved. Now, there's a lot of confusion about the concept of ICS versus SCADA. You'll hear all the time, people are like, oh yeah, I got these SCADA vulns, we need to protect the SCADA. So SCADA is sort of a subset of ICS, and SCADA I'll sort of dig more into a little bit later, but you can think of it as if ICS is physical security, SCADA would be an area like CCTV. So I'll go into some examples of pieces of ICS equipment, what makes up the various systems. It's by no means comprehensive. There are so many things. So we'll start off with the big one, SCADA, and it is supervisory control and data acquisition systems. These are really sort of in charge of managing processes over a large geographic area. If you can see in the graphic here, you see a lot of pretty squares, and each of those are really processes that are maybe spread out over a large geographic area. Let's say that you are a manufacturer and you have factories all over the country and you want to manage, see what kind of input and output is going through each of these factories, and you want to do it in a technical way. A SCADA system would be one way to do that. So the key word there is supervisory. These things don't really directly control, robotic arms and power generators and everything, but they provide information to the engineers and to the people who make decisions about the processes so that they can fine-tune things at other levels of the system. Human-machine interfaces. If you see any sort of media coverage, or if you go on like Shodan, something like that, and you look up ICS or SCADA systems, you'll probably come across something like this. This is basically just the pretty pictures that allow the engineers to sort of see what is going on inside the process and to control it at a sort of fine-grained level. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's on-off switches and little places you can put in numbers, and that's where they can turn individual motors and valves and pumps on and off and change numbers and pressure levels and all sorts of stuff. So if you're a pen tester and you get access to one of these and you find that you press buttons and things happen, you've won. So next up we have distributed control systems, DCS. So these are somewhat similar to SCADA systems in that they are in charge of managing things and looking over a lot of different processes, but they're not going to be over a huge geographic area. Typically it's going to be inside the four walls of a building or a property or something. An example would be maybe a water treatment plant. It may be spread out over 10, 20 acres, but it's all going to come back to something like this. Or let's say you have a factory and you have assembly lines that make cars and you have 36 different assembly lines. This thing is going to be one of the components that's sort of managing and controlling all of them at once and sending out orders of who needs to turn on, who needs to turn off, and things along those lines. The next step down, and probably one of the most common things, are going to be PLCs, programmable logic controllers, sometimes programmable logic circuits, you'll hear them called. These sort of sit a lot closer to the moving pieces of the processes. So what they do basically is they take data from the SCADAs and the DCS, and to use the metaphor of the factory from before, if we have 36 different assembly lines that are talking to the distributed control system, the PLC, the programmable logic controller, is going to be in charge of a single one, and it's going to get its orders from, up above, and it's just going to keep going until it gets down to actual, nuts and bolts moving parts. So another piece of equipment that you'll find a lot that is really essential to being able to monitor things is RTUs, remote terminal units, and these will sit fairly close to the moving parts, and also they'll be close to the PLCs. And their main job is to collect data from any sort of sensors and check for inputs and outputs and sort of send that data back to, the SCADA system or the distributed control system, something along those lines. Basically to just sort of get, a really finely grained vision of what's going on inside of the process. Then we have these little weird things called data historians, or, just historians. And they sort of exist at all different levels of the architecture, and their primary goal is to collect logs and just to store any sort of sensor data, inputs, outputs, orders given, anything along those lines. And it's for multiple purposes. Let's say that you have a catastrophic physical failure and you want to figure out what happened. If you have the logs, you're good. Also, for regulatory requirements, a lot of, in the energy industry, for example, if you don't have the logs of, your emissions and how much you're producing and things like this, there can be some huge fines. So these things are pretty important. Like I said, there are so many different pieces of equipment, and there are even more protocols that they speak. These are just some examples that you'll see. I mean, there's many, many more. Some of the more common ones are Modbus, DNP3, Open DNP3, things along those lines. For these protocols, a lot of times it's as simple as just a single register, just on, off. These are dead simple protocols a lot of the time, so that really comes in handy from a pen testing perspective if you can sort of get in the middle or if you can send some traffic, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So a typical ICS architecture is probably going to be made up something like the following. You're going to want to have three-ish zones. So you'll have your enterprise zone, and then you'll have your ICS DMZ and your process control zone. So your enterprise zone is going to be the stuff that we all deal with every day, typical IT, workstations, servers, email, databases, the stuff that we all live and breathe by. And so nothing really exciting is happening there so much. The ICS DMZ is very similar to the concept of a DMZ in a normal IT network. You want to control your ingress and egress of traffic and sort of determine what goes in and out. Also, you'll find a lot of times that the data historians, the things that keep the logs, they'll be stored here, or they'll replicate to here from inside the third zone, which is the process control zone. Now, this is the super sweet, awesome zone that you want to get to if you're a pen tester, and this is where all the actual ICS stuff lives. Ideally, you don't want this to be accessible at all from the enterprise zone, and you want access from the DMZ to be limited to, read-only type things, if at all possible. It's not always the case. Air gapping is never truly air gapped, so. If you want to sort of take a deeper dive into what that process control zone looks like, though, they're typically also made up of a layered architecture. In the upper layers, you'll have, your supervisory things. In the middle, you'll have your middlemen, and then you'll have, nuts and bolts moving parts at the lower parts. So in the uppermost layer is where you're going to find your human-machine interfaces, the pretty pictures, and then the SCADA systems, the things that are just big picture, hey, here's what's going on through all the different layers. And these are where most of the time the engineers and the process architects and all the people are going to be sitting, and they're going to be interacting with the processes and sort of controlling what's going to happen. Typically, it's engineering workstations, and they may have various specialty types of software they're using, or they may just have the pretty HMI pictures where they're just clicking buttons on and off. This talks primarily to the middle layer, and you'll see a lot of different protocols, but DNP3 and Modbus are pretty common. In the middle layer is the middleman stuff, so to speak, and that basically just relays orders from the top layer down to the relays orders from the top layer down to the lower layer, and then relays data from sensors and outputs and whatnot from the lower to the upper. And since it talks both ways, it can speak the Modbus and the DMP3, and it can also speak HARTs and Profibus and all these various protocols. So these things are sort of the middleman pieces of equipment. They're the field controllers. This can be your PLCs that are out there, and they're getting orders from above, and they're trying to coordinate a lot of the smaller pieces to go and do things. To sort of visualize it a little better, let's say that up there at the top, you have your engineers sitting there, and they're making changes, and they're saying, hey, we want to produce 56 cars, and then they send it out to the middle layer, which goes and coordinates and says, okay, we have 36 assembly lines, these 12 are capable of doing this. So you guys spin up, and each of you make a certain number. And then at the bottom layer, you have the things that are actually controlling the robotic arms and, the conveyor belts and whatnot, and are actually making it. And these are your field devices, with the remote terminal units are collecting data about, hey, it took this long for this process to happen, and then, it did this and that. And that is really sort of where, the nuts and bolts meat of where you want to be able to get to for a pen test is. If you can't, and if you can get up to the top and you can send traffic down, that's good. But if you can get access to that, just completely game over. So I've talked, a little bit about attacking, what you want to get into as a pen test. So obviously, why we're all here is risk. And with ICS, because it's tied to such critical systems, chemical production, food production, energy grids, there's a lot of risks involved. And it's made worse by the fact that when these things were originally designed back in the 60s, typically they weren't designed with security in mind, because the internet was in its infancy at that point. You didn't really have to worry about somebody being able to, run a port scan on your production network. So typically the only security that was in place was physical security, guns, gates, guards, that sort of thing. But another thing that is also sort of driving the fact that the risks are becoming higher for ICS and SCADA is that as things become more connected, people are going to focus more on security, and they're going to put out new products with security focus, but downtime on these things can be really bad. You have to schedule patching 2-3 years in advance sometimes if you're going to take down an entire plant, and it costs a lot of money to bring these things down. If your bread and butter of your company is you need this thing churning 24/7, and you take it down for 3 days, that could be millions of dollars worth of loss. Additionally, because these are such complex systems, if you patch something or introduce some sort of new equipment and something breaks, things can go very badly very quickly. And because these can be such critical systems, people can get poisoned food. You can cause blackouts all over the country. People can be injured. People can die. And you can blow things up, explosions. Does anybody have any questions? We good? Okay. So from a pen tester's perspective, we always want to think about, the threat model. What are the capabilities of the attackers, and who's going to want to go after this, and what are their motivations? So well-resourced and highly skilled attackers may completely skip all computery routes and just break into the building and plug something in, or blow something up with a bomb. But there's a lot of physical security that goes into these places. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen a nuclear plant. Good luck getting in. The more common scenario is that they will try to compromise the enterprise network and then try to pivot from there through the DMZ into the process control zone. And it's important to realize that because these things are so essential to so many things, there's so many regulatory requirements. If somebody's able to get in, even if they don't blow anything up, even if they don't get any data exfiltrated, the fact that they got in, and if that fact gets out, can cost millions of dollars in fines. It can cause your brand to just tank. It's a very serious thing, so you want to keep people out. So you really have to consider the motivations and the capabilities of various attackers. So you have your nation states, and obviously they're going to be able to get in. If they want to get in, they're getting in. You're not going to stop them. US, Russia, China, what have you. Then you have the guys like us, the pen testers, and we may be skilled, but we may not have time and or money like the nation states will. So different attack methods, different goals. Then you may have your less skilled attackers. And primarily, hopefully, they'll never get to your process control zone. If they do, you've got bigger problems. But imagine what would happen if somebody got in and, they had LOIC and they DDoSed, a production facility for natural gas or a pump that's going to stop the pressure from building too high. If they can DDoS that and knock that thing over, it could be kind of catastrophic. So hopefully they never get in, but if they do. And then the most dangerous class of attackers of all is Mother Nature. So it's not uncommon to hear about squirrels and chipmunks and all sorts of wildlife getting into a substation and biting the wrong thing, and then suddenly a neighborhood goes down in power until somebody can come out and figure out what happened and scoop up the charred remains and have dinner for the night or whatever. Also, hurricanes, blizzards, anything of that sort. If you look at any major storm from the past 30, 40 years, I mean, the amount of power outages or just damage that is caused is just catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of households without power, hospitals can go without power for whatever amount of time. It could be very bad. So there's some specific instances of ICS security-related events that have happened. So one, and I think there's a talk tomorrow that goes into this one in depth. I'm looking forward to it. But supposedly in 1982, the Soviets tried to steal some ICS software from a Canadian company, and the CIA got word of that, introduced some malicious code, and it ended up blowing up a Siberian pipeline, and it was one of the biggest non-nuclear explosions ever recorded. So highly skilled and big impact. But then if you take a look, in 97, there was a kid who was just war dialing around in his neighborhood, and he came across, a bank of phones that were related to an airport. He shut the thing down for, I think it was 2 days. So, low skill, but still huge impact. So it's really all over the place with this. In 2000, there was he wasn't even a hacker, so to speak. He was just, a disgruntled SCADA engineer. And it was this guy in Australia. He was sort of upset that he didn't get a job at the local municipal water treatment facility. So he decided, hey, you know what? I'm just going to get in here and let all this raw sewage everywhere. So 800,000 liters, I think. Just imagine that in here. He did it at a hotel, a Hyatt Regency. So that could happen to us. But then, that was obviously very crafted and malicious, but then you have something that doesn't really care where it's going, like the slammer worm, and it shut down a nuclear plant in Ohio for 5 hours. And a nuclear plant shutdown is usually not a good thing, because you could, there's quite a bit of research that's gone into what can happen. So in 2007, at Idaho Falls National Labs, they did something called the Aurora Generator Experiment. And basically what they tried to do is figure out, with 10 to 12 lines of Python, what happens if you send a bunch of ICS, I believe it was DNP3 traffic at a power generator, and you just turn it off and on really fast. And I'll show you in a minute what happens. But then you have, those were highly resourced researchers, but then, the very next year you had a Polish teenager who decided, hey, I'm going to change this TV remote and start pointing it at different train switching stations, and he caused a few derailments. So different skill levels, different types of outcomes. Give me a second here. Try to get this thing. So this is the Aurora Generator Experiment. That thing's about the size of a bus. It's not supposed to do that. That's usually not good. Exactly. If you do a pen test and you get that to happen, that's a critical finding. All right. So that was obviously a bad thing. Is it? Okay. So then in 2010, obviously Stuxnet was a big deal. This is a partially redacted picture of the actual Stuxnet worm, but it's de-weaponized. You don't have to worry about it getting you. But what it actually did was it went in, and between the human-machine interface and the programmable logic controllers, the PLCs, it was able to man in the middle of that traffic and sort of tell the engineers, hey, everything's fine, everything's cool, it's exactly what it's supposed to be, and then to the actual equipment, it's saying, yeah, break yourself. And then it broke itself. And then Russia likes to do a lot of stuff with this. In 2015, 2016, and then I actually read literally right before this talk, like last month in the Baltics, they keep going into all these power grids in Eastern Europe and the Baltic regions and just shutting down the power just for fun. And then to just be extra nice, they'll DDoS the call centers so people can't report the outages so it can last for a really long time. So there are some takeaways from this. So whenever you're attacking these things, a goal is obviously going to be a man in the middle. If you can get between into the traffic flow and you can send stuff up to the engineers and say everything's fine when everything's not fine, and then if you can make things not fine, obviously you're winning on that report. That's critical. It's also important to realize that there's often no authentication. So if you get a man in the middle and it's not one of the newer protocols that account for authentication, then any commands you send, it's just going to listen and be like, oh, you want me to blow myself up? Got it. So for a pen test, though, you really have to get the biggest effects. You want to combine process knowledge, so you want to know what the actual system is trying to make, what its weak points are, and what would be the worst thing to fail. And you want to combine that with your security knowledge to try to figure out, okay, how can we get from point A to point B, and how can we write that up? And that's how you get a 5-star report, so many criticals. So with an ICS engagement, you really have to approach it in a special way. Obviously, based on what I've told you and just the way things are, if somebody gets into the lower levels of the ICS infrastructure in the process control network, it's game over. So if you want to really give a good pen test, you're not going to want to target that. The things you want to really go after are the network segmentation. Just check that. That is going to be the absolute key to providing a good ICS pen test. So one of the important things to consider with these type of engagements is that in order for them to sort of pivot from the enterprise, they've probably already compromised the enterprise. So when scoping these things, you really have to consider that you're already going to have domain admin, or you're already going to have some degree of control over the enterprise as a whole before you start trying to find ways to get into the ICS system. So whenever you're going in and you're trying to plan your attack, you need to have sort of a plan, and it's sort of 3 phases. You want to do intel gathering. You want to do a lot of that. Then you want to identify the entry points, just the cracks in the fence, in the wall, where you can just slip through. If you can do that, then you're in, you've won. And then from there, you want to make sure, okay, I could get in, but just how much can I get in? And then at that point, you really know the extent of the potential breach. So assuming that it's part of a larger red team style engagement, you may gain physical access to a facility. And if you can, you want to try and go and seek out engineering workstations or just desks. You want to look for meeting rooms with whiteboards, any sort of diagrams you can find. If you can find vendor payment bills, vendor statements, just try to figure out anything you can about, okay, what is in their ICS system, what types of equipment, what the network looks like, what it's actually making, and what it looks like from an architecture perspective. Every little thing helps. Also, if you have domain admin, you can sort of leverage Active Directory and any sort of access you may have to try to target individual people or groups. So you want to go obviously after the process engineers and the process operators, but also anyone that sort of does IT for the process systems, or if they have any sort of crossover functionality, then you want to go after them, because if you can, use their credits and use their credentials, and then you can use PS exec or something, or just get into their file shares, then you can really get in and sort of figure out what types of access they have, what types of files they have. And this can really help with narrowing down, okay, if I were going to pivot from the enterprise to the DMZ and beyond, these are probably the people that would be able to do it through. So once you gain access to those people's systems, you really want to look for any kind of network documentation and diagrams and design documentation that you can find, because this can provide really useful information like host names and IP addresses, which, in a usual engagement, it's kind of useful, give you an idea of targets, but in this, it can be critical when you're trying to find pathways. So places that you can find this, if you get access to their workstations, check their documents, their downloads, whatever. But also if they have access to any file shares or SharePoints, things like that, you want to look for any type of documentation, Visio diagrams, PDFs, Word docs, pictures, any kind of notes that you can find. Anything that you can find that helps is going to make it easier later. Also, if these people work on the ICS process control network stuff, then they probably have some kind of notes or official documentation on how to actually interact with those systems. And if you can figure out, hey, we have this custom tool that if you just run this executable, it'll just drop you, connect you to a VPN or something that we just rolled in-house. If you can figure that out and ride on the back of that, you're in, easy win. Also, it's not uncommon because of the nature of these types of systems to find, shared credentials that might just be right there in the documentation. Also, an interesting place to check is if you can find backups of any sort of networking equipment that may be on the edges of the zones or even from the process control networks. You can figure out if they have any sort of remote connectivity, RDP, any sort of SSH stuff, Citrix desktop access maybe. And you can also figure out IP addressing schemes and routes and figure out how the data flows and how you could flow with the data to get where you need to get into the process control zones. So hopefully you've collected a lot of data at this point. Now what you want to do is you want to try to find those points where you can get through, because that's really going to be the key to conducting a good ICS engagement, is proving, hey, from here to there, this is how we did it. So you're going to want to definitely leverage any sort of credentials that you've found. You're going to want to use any sort of permissions that you may have from the engagement. And hopefully at this point you've identified some weak points in the armor, so to speak. It's not uncommon for there to be, jump boxes or some sort of way for them to connect to the networks through, a single point. And you could have identified this through the network documentation, or you could have, found some credentials on machines. But if you can get access to these things, then it can be really helpful. But as with any engagement, if you come across 2FA, any sort of multi-factor authentication, it can obviously complicate things. But there are ways around it, but I won't go into that here. VPN access also, if you are able to figure out a way to just get dropped into a VPN that might connect to these networks, obviously that's going to be something that you're going to want to target. But as with anything else, multi-factor, 2FA, that can definitely complicate things. Targets of interest are definitely dual-homed hosts, so things with 2 or more network cards in them. If you can find systems that are maybe sitting in the DMZ and they connect to the enterprise network and to the process network, and if you're able to pivot through these machines, you might have an easy way in. It's actually fairly common to find at least 1 or 2 things like this, because historians need to be able to get the regulatory data out of the process control networks and to the regulators. There may be a sort of internet connection directly from one of these machines and it doesn't go through the layers, but typically there's going to be some way for that data to get from point A to point B, and you need to find it. One good way to find that is, if you can use your Windows tools, WMI and PSExec, and you find the users that are able to access these sort of things, if you can check any of their access logs or dump their routing tables and figure out, based on the reconnaissance that you had done previously of what the process control network IP ranges look like, you can figure out, hey, this guy's able to talk here and here, so this is probably a good spot to start. So that would definitely come in handy. But obviously that can be really time consuming, so for larger enterprises, you just gotta sort of hope you get lucky and land on a good target. A juicy target is going to be the historians, because they're going to have a lot of data of critical functions within the network, and if you're able to determine what types of stuff are being reported out to the historians, you can figure out what's important to that organization or important to the process overall. And that can make it a lot easier once you pivot into that area to figure out what your targets will be. So these are very juicy targets. They can be kind of hard to find because, you know, with each vendor, they have different ports and different protocols and different software, but there are typically some ways to find them. So hopefully at this point, you've got some sort of credentials or something, you've found a way to get in, and you've been able to pivot through. But let's assume that, you know, you've run into, you know, a brick wall, so to speak, and you've found that, you know, you can't figure out any way to get credentials to stuff, but you can see the machines, but you can't figure out any way to get in. You know, the gateways might be perfectly patched, or you just don't have any sort of exploit to get in. Fear not, because weak passwords are here to save the day. There are a lot of reasons that there are password problems in these types of networks. Typically, if you are an engineer in one of these types of processes and you need quick access to something, say a nuclear reactor that might be melting down, a complex password can take time to type in, you may fat finger it, and that can be really bad, especially if you have any sort of password lockouts. And so due to the critical nature of these, a lot of times there is no password lockout. So you can just sort of brute force your way in. You know, you can brute force the passwords all day. Also, if you have credentials from the enterprise network, a lot of times you'll find that people will use them in both places just because it's easier to remember. Also, default credentials are very much in use. You know, there's a lot of times where they may lock down all the accounts they've created, but there may be an admin account that came fresh out of the box that nobody ever bothered to take down. You know, stuff like admin, roots, or manager and friend. I don't know what the story is with that one. But another way to sort of get credentials is if you check all the documentation, it's very easy to sort of understand based on the risks associated with it being hard to get into these things why they would do this. But if you're able to find official documentation on how to get in, you can probably find plain text creds in the network documentation. Another way that's really interesting, and it's not too common, but if their Active Directory structure extends into the process control zone, then if you have permissions on one account, you may be able to just pivot right on through. So obviously you don't want to end up in that situation. Due to the nature of how hard it is to patch these things, it's not uncommon to find things with vulns from, 10, 20 years ago even. I mean, MS 08067 is still a way to get into these, And actually, Windows 2000 is sometimes, super upgraded compared to some of these. I mean, I've heard cases where people are running Windows 98, 95. I heard one case of 3.1 still in the wild, still being used on a production system to this day. But hopefully at this point, you've been able to get in, find something, and get some wins. But if not, here's a couple easy wins for you. If you're in the corporate network and you're sniffing packets and you come across some kind of ICS traffic, that's a critical finding. If you find an HMI that's accessible in the enterprise area or one in the DMZ that's not read-only, it's a critical finding. If you're able to get access to the enterprise network and then you just do an nmap scan or a port scan or something, and then it knocks over something in the process control zone and kills a bunch of people, it's a critical finding. So that's about all I've got time for, but due to the fact that everybody's wanting everything to be more easily accessible and business owners want to know more about their processes and the types of data that are coming out and how they can optimize their production, there's going to be more and more ways into these networks, but it's still going to be hard to patch these things. So it's only going to be a bigger problem. For my company, we've been doing a lot of research on this stuff lately, and this presentation is actually sort of the product of a couple of blog posts. We posted the first one this past week, we're posting another one next week, and we're just going to keep putting this stuff out. So more to come on this. This is a lot of fun. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me afterwards, or we can talk about it now if you want.